Step two. So step two takes right at about 6 weeks. And this can be a very difficult but incredibly important step to take because we need to identify the assets that we have for CMMC. So we're going to walk through asset type by asset type and give examples of what those actually look like. So first up, I want to introduce you to Big Acronym. So this is Big Acronym as we know it today. You see some very common office spaces here. We have a reception, we have an IT room, we have a production floor, we have cloud services they might be using. And so we're going to pull out different elements and talk about what kind of CMMC assets those actually are. So first up we have on the list is CUI assets. So what is a CUI asset? An asset that processes, stores, or transmit controlled unclassified information, or CUI. So on the left-hand side here, you see some examples. We have servers and printers and mobile phones and different cloud services, even local on-prem applications like ERP systems that you might have. So what are the requirements? What do I have to do with this type of asset? Well, I have to document it, and I have to document it a lot. So I have to make sure it's in my asset inventory. I have to make sure it's in my system security plan and my network diagram. But here's the wonderful thing at the end. I also have to make sure that it's configured appropriately, following the CMMC level 2 controls, because that's what Big Acronym's going after. They want to be CMMC level 2 certified. Next up in the list, as we're looking at the landscape of Big Acronym, we want to talk about another type of asset. And that asset type is security protection assets, or an SPA, as you're going to see on the next screen here. So security protection assets, they're going to support your CMMC compliance state, right? So they're going to be able to provide security tooling, could be a SIM tool, could be endpoint protection tools, other tools that don't necessarily or don't have to have CUI, but are going to protect the assets that do, right? So example here is we have Sophos, we have Symantec. Both are current products that Big Acronym is using today. So what does that mean, right? What do I have to do with these types of assets? Well, just like before for CUI, I have to do the same thing. I have to document them in SSP and assets. And I also have to document them in my network diagram, but I also have to make sure that the CMMC level 2 practices are applied to these different items. Now, here's a fun thing, and we're going to show this here on the next slide. Not only is it a technology that's a security protection asset, but there are also things like people, right? So an enterprise administrator can be a security protection asset, or one that's commonly overlooked, managed service providers, which we're going to talk in more detail in step 5. But it's very important to know that this isn't just a technology problem, right? This is a operational classification, different types of assets involved in that. So make sure that you're expanding your scope when you're looking at these different assets in your environment to include people and third-party organizations that you depend on.
Yeah, and just a comment there, if you need more information about scoping and what that looks like, the Step 2 blog is specifically about scoping, and there's a link to the scoping guidance from DoD. There's a link to the level 2 scoping guidance, and it breaks all this down. So that's a good deep dive to walk into that.
Yeah, that's a great one. This is very high level, right? We want to make sure that you have the core understanding, and then go back to cmmc.blog and take a look at all of the supplemental articles that we have. So next up, we're going to talk about contractor risk managed asset. So a contractor risk managed asset are assets that, due to different controls, whether it's policies and procedures or technical controls, shouldn't have CUI on them, but can live around CUI assets, right? So the question is, what do I have to do with these types of things? The two examples we have here are visitor management systems. So this is just users checking into the office, as well as the receptionist computer, right? We don't need CUI on those assets. They should never touch it based on what their job and their responsibility is. But here's something that's unique, right? Not only do you have to document it, which is great, you need to be very certain that you can prove that they're not going to have CUI on them, that you've mitigated that risk appropriately. So Joy here on the line with us, she's going to talk about that in a little bit more detail from an assessor's approach. Joy?
Yeah, I think that, thank you, Daniel. The CRMA asset, contractor risk managed, is a tricky one. And it's going to be easy for an organization to want to classify something that really should be a CUI asset or a security protection asset instead as contractor risk managed, because they won't have to prove that they've gone through the full 110 controls for CMMC for those. But the documentation that they do provide to show how they manage that risk is going to be scrutinized. So in the assessor process that we'll touch on at the very end, how you scope those items that are CRMA is going to have to be backed up by the documentation on how you manage the risk that those assets present as being a part of the network, but not having all the 110 controls applied. So good call there.
Thank you, Joy. All right. So now we're on to the very last asset type that we're going to talk about today. And that's going to be in what we call an SA, or a specialized asset. So these are assets that may or may not have CUI on them, right? They include operational technology, government equipment, test equipment, things like that that you might be using in your organization today. So as manufacturers, we might have a CNC machine, right? These would be considered specialized assets. Now, the requirements are a little looser, right? We just have to be able to document those both in the asset inventory, the system security plan, and the network diagram. Now, you're seeing quite the trend here, right? A lot of documentation. We're going to talk about that a lot in step 6, but know that we need to have a core understanding of all of the different people, third-party services, and technology that we're currently using, in this case, in big acronym, to make sure that we're putting everybody and everything in the right bucket. Awesome. All right. So that concludes step 2. And step 2 is really important. And we typically say step 2 takes about 4 weeks. But to be honest, it could take your organization even longer, right? So, I mean, we're talking 50 people here, right? If your organization's larger than that, then you're going to need to spend some more time, maybe look through and identify all your third-party partners that you have today, all the different technology that your team is using, both corporate approved technology and maybe something called shadow IT, right? We need to make sure that we're identifying all of those different connections and systems and put them in the correct bucket.